400 excombatientes de las FARC que le apostaron a construir la paz han sido asesinados en Colombia.
Do you agree with the notion that communities or groups like Las FARC, who stand for a certain set of values, are justified in adopting or applying any means necessary to achieve their objectives?
I see members of the FARC first as victims and then as perpetrators. Why first as victims? Because the FARC guerrilla movement was created in a context where the state never brought education, healthcare, or housing to the territories where people had demanded them, and instead what arrived was state violence.
People in Colombia continue voting for individuals contributing to the continuation of the conflict itself. Why do you think that is the case?
First, because they needed to instill an ideology of the internal enemy. So, communism is everywhere. And besides instilling that ideology, any action by the public forces becomes legitimate. If the first thing I do is legitimize the idea that communism is infiltrating the country, as happened in Vietnam, as happened in Iraq, as happened in other countries, in Cuba, right? Then what do you achieve? You strengthen the war.
Hi there, and welcome to Pax Politica. What if I told you that in Colombia, a former guerrilla member, a leader of an indigenous community, and a student with a wealthy private background came together and tried to define what it meant to be Colombian? Hard to believe, right? Well, I met someone who did exactly that, except in classrooms. Much like a lot of other Global South contexts, education in Colombia is seen as either a privilege for those who have money or a hard-won right for those who don't. So, when we scale this idea of education to a profession that is almost always caught between ethical duties and economic pressures, it gets even more complex. Social anthropologists, like Oscar Eduardo Castañeda, are often caught in an attempt to maintain a balance between the interests of marginalized communities and corporations reliant on the extraction of natural resources. But in a country that's been through almost 70 years of war, that question isn't a question for boardrooms anymore. It's much, much more. So, in this video, Oscar Castañeda walks us through what it's like to navigate such environments and his journey from private higher education to Colombia's Universidad Nacional, his work as a peace educator, and his candid thoughts on the evolving idea of justice in a post-war context. Stick around and don't forget to subscribe for more such stories. You told me that you're from the Universidad Nacional. What made you choose this university in the first place?
I chose the National University of Colombia because it is a public university. And in that sense, public education in Colombia is completely different from private education because it does not depend on companies or political parties that might be funding the university as such. Instead, it depends on the state, the Colombian state. And insofar as it is public, it simply reaffirms one thing, that education is a right. It should be a right, and not a privilege in Colombia. So that was my conviction when choosing the National University of Colombia. But I should clarify something. I first studied at a private university and later at the National University of Colombia. So I went through private higher education and then arrived at a public university. Completely different environments.
Right. From an educational perspective, you told me that you pursued social anthropology. Now, I studied anthropology for my bachelor's degree as well. And one thing that struck out for me as an anthropologist, or at least as a person who has a degree in anthropology, was that human beings are undoubtedly complex. Societies are complex, often driven by beliefs, values, that some of which could be perceived as controversial. In my limited time in Colombia, society here appears to be quite different as well. People in Bogota have one set of perspectives. People within certain stratas or even districts within Bogota have another set of perspectives. However, the Universidad Nacional, to me, appears to me a really interesting mixture of different perspectives. Have those perspectives changed the way you look at Colombian society, given your education at this university?
Completely. Because at public universities, especially at the National University of Colombia, there's a convergence of indigenous population, Afro-descendant populations, and victims of the armed conflict. But there are also people from private schools, people from poor backgrounds, and people with different beliefs and spiritualities. When you are, let's say, sharing classroom spaces with these people, they bring their own stories about what it means to be a Colombian. So it definitely has a huge influence. Unlike private education, where people access it mainly through money, public education creates a different environment. In private universities, access is largely determined by the ability to pay, which often results in somewhat homogeneous perspective within the classroom. That's not to deny that in private universities, there are also people who gain access through loans or educational benefits. But in public universities, the people who come together often gain access through their abilities, not so much because they have money, but because of their capabilities. And that is also reflected in the classroom discussion space. The problem is that there are very few places available for people to access university, so the number of people who end up studying in public institutions is quite limited.
From an educational perspective, you once told me that you have applied and adapted social anthropology to some of the peace education modules that you impart and also teach about armed conflict to young people, and have worked with indigenous communities in Bogota and wider Colombia. What I would like to know from you is whether what you have studied as a social anthropologist has ever conflicted with the requirements from peace education and expectations from peace education that communities who have been affected by the conflict in Colombia, have you ever seen or felt a difference between what you have taught and what you believe communities need and what they actually need?
Yes, definitely. Because, at least in Colombia, anthropology, unfortunately, often exists to help prevent indigenous or Afro descendant communities from having their resources expropriated. But what ends up happening is that since the amount of money a social anthropologist earns in Colombia is very low, many end up working to defend the companies that extract resources from those territories. So it becomes a complete turnaround, a complete contradiction. The social anthropologist ends up acting as a mediator between the company and the indigenous or Afro descendant community so that the resources can be extracted rather than preventing their extraction. And this is a huge problem because the armed conflict in Colombia is also linked to the extraction of resources. Many of the main forms of victimization that occur in Colombia are related to the extraction of gold, large-scale mining, the pollution of rivers, right? Much of what we are taught at university ends up being overshadowed by the purchasing power that a company has to offer you a better salary. So that is huge problem when it comes to applying anthropology and acting according to what I believe. I always think about defending the community because that is why I studied anthropology, to put myself in another person's shoe. But in the end, I also need to survive. If I am offered a higher salary, I might end up defending a company instead. Fortunately, that has not been my case. But I know it is the case for many anthropologists.
Across all the time that you spent traveling throughout Colombia and wider Latin America, what has stood out as the most vivid memory when you have worked with indigenous communities, local communities, and groups that have been directly or indirectly affected by the conflict, and also suffer from a lack of access to resources, as you mentioned earlier?
I believe that the most memorable experience I've had, the most significant one, is that no matter where I go in Colombia, I always encounter someone who is a victim of the armed conflict. Always. And unfortunately, in that country, this is memorable because it only confirms something we mentioned earlier, that 1 in 5 people in Colombia has suffered from the armed conflict. And one might ask, why is that memorable? Basically, because at the same time, despite having been affected by the conflict, these people remain tremendously kind. They still have a kind of warmth and charisma that stands in contrast to the war, even though institutionally the war never truly ends because it serves certain interests. I always meet people who, despite what they have suffered, are willing to open the doors of their homes and their communities to share a little food even when they do not have much. So, that sense of community that persists, despite attempts to fragment it, is the most memorable thing I encounter everywhere I go. Regardless of who may have taken a loved one from them or who may have harmed them in one way or another, there are still people who are willing to open their homes and welcome you with great warmth. So, yes, I think that is the most memorable thing, and it repeats itself again and again, over and over.
Throughout all your interactions and travel, have you ever worked directly or indirectly or interacted with armed groups as well? Guerrilla groups? People from Las FARC or ALN, maybe? Or any paramilitary groups as well?
Yes, especially with the FARC side, because I worked with the Truth Commission of Colombia, and there we had to organize what were called accountability encounters, spaces where the FARC had to take responsibility for what they did, particularly regarding kidnapping, and the people they abducted and deprived of their freedom in order to politically finance the guerrilla movement. And if there is something that Colombians strongly criticize the FARC for, it is that they kidnapped members of the public security forces, civilians, and people who had nothing to do with the war. So within the Truth Commission, we worked to create a meeting where they acknowledged that responsibility, saying, yes, we carried out kidnappings. There is no justification for having kidnapped people, and we are willing to help build peace. That was one part of the work. On the other hand, the Truth Commission also collected interviews with victims and with those responsible for the armed conflict. That included paramilitaries, guerrilla members, and victims of the armed conflict. Each of those people has a story behind them that allows you to realize that despite ideology, no matter how different we may be, they all experienced some form of suffering in their childhood. Regardless of whether someone became a paramilitary, a guerrilla member, or part of the public forces, they all went through something that ultimately led them to war. So that is key to understanding the conflict.
Since my time in Colombia, there have been quite a few people I've met, spoken to, interacted with, many of whom the popular West or media in the popular West would consider FARC sympathizers. Unfortunately, guerrilla groups or armed rebels that stand for a certain set of values, no matter where in the world, often get a bad reputation due to popular media. Las FARC, in my experience, has been no different. However, many people through my interactions have said, what is there to be so fascinated about the FARC? At the end of the day, they are just people like you and I who believe in a certain set of values. Do you agree with that notion? After having worked with people and communities that have lost loved ones, they've lost property, they have suffered at the hands of rebellious groups in Colombia, there are people in Bogota who have been indirectly affected by the conflict as well. So do you agree with the notion that communities or groups like Las FARC, who stand for a certain set of values, are justified in adopting or applying any means necessary to achieve their objectives? Do you see them the same way as, for the lack of a better phrase, FARC sympathizers see them?
I see members of the FARC first as victims and then as perpetrators. Why first as victims? Because the FARC guerrilla movement was created in a context where the state never brought education, healthcare, or housing to the territories where people had demanded them, and instead what arrived was state violence. So the FARC emerged as victims of state violence. In that sense, they were first victims, then revolutionaries, and eventually they became responsible actors in the conflict. So, in that regard, the FARC had a justification for their emergence because when these demands were made through dialogue and the government never responded, they resorted to war. What became unjustifiable, however, was that they kidnapped, extorted, and killed people who had nothing to do with the conflict and displaced communities from the 1980s onwards. In the 1980s, the FARC began to finance themselves through drug trafficking, through coca and marijuana, and from that point on, they became degraded. They stopped being primarily political and became economic in many ways. But the FARC did have a foundation for their emergence. They were first victims and then they became revolutionaries.
It's interesting that you have this perspective because prior to coming to Colombia, I read a little bit about Latin American history. I have been a student of conflict transformation, peace building, and human rights, and I have a natural tendency to read a lot about conflict situations, either in the past or present. And I happened to read that Haiti and the Dominican Republic were among the first countries to be colonized by the Spaniards, followed by Colombia. So much so that such was their degree of transformation and influence on the continent that they forced indigenous groups and communities to adapt and change their lifestyles by 180 degrees, even drop their native languages and adopt Spanish to facilitate an easier means and modes of communication. They even tampered with the natural race and the genetic composition of the continent by bringing in slaves from across Africa. Indigenous communities, it is safe to say, in my opinion, have a much longer history than guerrilla groups like Las FARC. Having worked with indigenous groups yourself, do you still believe it is fair on victims of the Colombian conflict to look at Las FARC as a community or a group rather with as much sympathy for their issues compared to indigenous groups that have suffered a lot more, not just at the hands of paramilitary groups or Las FARC or ALN for that matter, but even Spanish colonizers, many of whom throughout my travels in Colombia are still revered.
Definitely. Similarities can be drawn between indigenous communities and people from the FARC, especially because of what you mentioned. Indigenous communities in Colombia and in Latin America more broadly were around 11 million people, and in less than a century, the Spaniards reduced that number to about 1 million indigenous people. Then, the worst thing the Spaniards could do to indigenous people was not only colonize them mentally, but take away their land. And the moment their land was taken away, it became the underlying pattern of the entire armed conflict in Colombia. Their land was taken and used for external purposes that benefited other countries outside Colombia. So indigenous peoples were left without land. And once they lost their land, they were exploited to strengthen the economic interests of other countries. Something similar happened with the FARC. However, more than indigenous, the FARC were largely made up of peasants. And the problem with peasants is that their very notion of existence is tied to the land, just like indigenous communities. The similarity is that both were dispossessed of their land and were then forced into systems that serve the interests of other countries or the dynamics of violence.
So far, it seems apparent to me that there have been needs and expectations that a number of stakeholders have not been able to fulfill. Of indigenous communities, as well as Colombia's local population residing in cities and larger towns. Has there been any interaction you've had with a person that you can recall at this point in time that really exposed this lack of coordination and a unified approach to helping indigenous communities reconcile with their past, thereby preventing the emergence of guerrilla groups in Colombia in the first place? I would like to believe that narco-trafficking or being economically viable or generating a profit purely could not have been the means and the reason for guerrilla groups to emerge in the first place. There probably were unmet expectations along the way that forced communities to adopt violence. So has there been any interaction that you can recall with a person or even a group of people that really exposed the stark difference between needs of the government in Colombia and needs of the people, and where this relationship between stakeholders and communities has failed?
Okay, yes, not personally, but through a film. The film is called Ciro y Yo. It tells the story of a man whose first son was killed by the FARC guerrillas. His second son is recruited by paramilitary groups, and his third son joins the public security forces in Colombia. So the father of these three sons ends up suffering the consequences of paramilitarism, the public forces, and the FARC. He is also a peasant who lives in one of the most beautiful places in Colombia called Caño Cristales, a place people visit to see incredible natural beauty. Yet, in that same place, all three armed groups converge in the background. What this reflects is that, first, he becomes a victim of the state because the state was not capable of guaranteeing security. Second, he becomes a victim of the FARC due to the state's inability to provide that security. And third, he becomes a victim of paramilitarism because of the relationships that exist between the state and paramilitary groups. So I feel that he is a person who reflects the inconsistencies between what the state demands and what the state actually provides.
It's interesting that you gave me examples about films that depict the loss of life, especially young life, children. And that is what I would like to focus on next. Having studied at the Universidad Nacional, which to my knowledge at the moment is embroiled, is busy in controversy with respect to the war in Gaza, with respect to corruption taking place at the administrative level, even with respect to socio-economic issues in Colombia itself. However, what I would like to know is how relevant, how important do you see young people in Colombia to the national peace process? The reason why I ask you this is because it seems to me that young people, so far in my time in Colombia, have been deeply engaged with teaching peace to other young people belonging to impoverished or underprivileged or economically weaker communities in Colombia. However, I also see, on the other hand, a community of young people that is frustrated with the state, that is anxious where money and economic comfort and privileges are concerned. I also see young people who are fighting against policies taken by the state. So the conditions for young people to voluntarily join guerrilla groups or start protest movements or adopt violent means on their own are pretty ripe, are pretty strong. So how important and relevant do you see young people to the peace process, the wider peace process taking place in Colombia itself?
First of all, I want to make a kind of statement that is, so to speak, unquestionable. If it hadn't been for young people in Colombia protesting for 3 years, 2019, 2020, and 2021, against the government of Ivan Duque, we would not have a president like Gustavo Petro today. In other words, the presence of young people during the social uprising or national strike in those years was tremendously decisive in bringing a different kind of government into Colombian politics after 200 years of history. If community kitchens had not been organized, if events like Noches Sin Miedo had not taken place, where people showed the police that even if they had weapons, they would not be able to silence the political movement in Colombia, we would not have the president we have now. The problem now is that even though we achieved that political change, he has not been able to govern effectively in favor of young people. For example, by implementing a policy of free higher education for everyone. This is because even though the presidency changed, the traditional political classes of the country, those who have governed for 200 years, still dominate the Congress. And since we live in a democracy, that prevents deep reforms from happening without first negotiating with that traditional class. So the question becomes, how are you supposed to take away the business and power of the traditional political class in this country? By negotiating reforms with them? The first thing they do is say they will not negotiate, and then reforms related to education, pensions, and healthcare end up becoming blocked. But young people continue acting outside of the state's institutional framework. For example, here at the National University of Colombia, you can see community kitchens being organized, concerts taking place, spaces where people continue building the country beyond formal reforms. So young people have been decisive, and many of them are committed to the non-repetition of violence. Many young people are no longer within the discourse of let's form a guerrilla movement, because that idea no longer has strength in the 21st century. Instead, they place their hopes in community kitchens, concerts, and in building peace.
Have you come across any young people who think and believe differently?
Yes, sí.
Yes, definitely.
How so?
For example, having studied at a private university, you encounter a lot of people who support this country's traditional elite and who believe. There's even a classic phrase for it. The poor are poor because they want to be. And it's very difficult to refute that statement when you know it comes from the privilege of everything they have experienced, right? It's also very hard to explain to them that poverty cannot simply be a mindset, but rather the result of state policies. But because they come from privilege, they think in a radically different way, and that does a lot of damage to the country. It's not so much about not tolerating each other, but about how their discourse legitimizes hateful policies against people who have historically been subjected to violence in Colombia.
So you spoke about the perspective of young people towards socio-economic inequality in Colombia. Can you tell me if there are any students or young people in your circle who you know of or have interacted with who feel somewhat the same way about the conflict in Colombia itself? I'll tell you why I'm asking. I once attended an event at Centro Americano de Bogota, and we were presenting one of our films. That film covered the perspectives of a former FARC member and the co-founder of La Casa de la Paz, Doris Suárez Guzman. After watching the film, one member of the audience said, "It is interesting to get a perspective from the other side, but it is still difficult for us to watch because of what we as people in Colombia went through. We believe that it is helpful for a perspective from the other side to come out. Only then can we build peace. But it is still not easy for us to hear and listen to what people who have contributed to violence and the death and loss of lives in Colombia. It is still difficult to hear what they have to say, or to even acknowledge them for that matter." Now, these are very strong emotions. And I can well imagine how people would feel about the government's plans and efforts to integrate former FARC members into mainstream society. In fact, I remember even during my interactions with Doris, she told us that there are still many people who, in public, insult them. They stay away from them, and in some cases, they even fear them because of what they might do. So I'd like to know whether there are any young people who you know of or have interacted with who feel the same way, who feel a sense of fear, who feel a sense of disgust, despite efforts that the Colombian government is trying to make.
Yes, I know people. I know people on both sides. Definitely. The people I know the most are those who recognize that Colombia has experienced an armed conflict. These people, especially young people, organize what are called assemblies. There are local youth assemblies, assemblies in Suba Oriental, assemblies in Usaquén, in different parts of Bogota and the country. And all the people who organize assemblies to build popular power acknowledge that there has been armed conflict, recognize the injustices that have occurred in Colombia, and also see the need to build peace. But one also knows a lot of young people whose first reaction is to deny the conflict from a place of privilege, saying that there has been no conflict in Colombia, or, as you said, they start insulting people from the FARC. It's hard to believe they still insult Doris today, continuing to attack her even though she represents building peace, betting on a completely different approach from war, which is creating a Casa de la Paz, and yet she still receives insults from people. And not only that, but their insults turned into bullets because more than 400 former FARC combatants who committed to building peace have been murdered in Colombia to this day. So, you will definitely encounter both sides of this reality embodied in young people. What I want to believe is that there are more young people who believe in building peace and in recognizing what has happened.
Before I came to Colombia, I had an idea that Colombia is rather a country that has been affected by decades of conflict, dating all the way back to the 1930s when there was a civil war between the conservatives and the liberals in the country. So I had a stereotype in my mind that infrastructure in Colombia would be poor. There would be a lot of areas in Colombia where people would be extremely poor. I had an impression that security is going to definitely be an issue in Bogota, given the fact that there would still be paramilitary groups and dissidents of Las FARC active in suburban areas surrounding Bogota. When I landed here, however, a lot of my perceptions changed. In fact, there was a lot about Bogota and Colombia, rather, that surprised me. The fact that there were large shopping malls, international brands, people wearing expensive clothing, driving Porsches and Ferraris and Lamborghinis. There was a lot about Bogota that surprised me. It told me that maybe the war in Colombia was not as bad as international media made it out to be. But the more I spoke to people, the more I interacted with them, the more I realized that the war was primarily concentrated in areas of Colombia outside Bogota. It was a fight for resources. It was a fight for independent and individual and community-led needs. It was a fight against capitalism. It was a fight for socialist values, if I could say so. What I find interesting is the fact that there are still people in Colombia existing who completely dismiss the conflict, who believe that the conflict never happened and that there is no conflict in the country. What is more worrying and troubling is the fact that these are young people in privileged positions where they do enjoy the advantages that economic wealth and prosperity brings to their lives. What does that tell you about the future of Colombia?
That scares me a lot. Because, as you explain well, these people who deny the conflict come from powerful families that have always had access to power. And they are the same people who end up in Congress. They are the same people who block reforms. And to get into Congress, you basically either need a political business or money. Because to be elected as a congressperson, you need a certain voting threshold. And to reach people to vote for you, you need money, since votes are essentially bought. So, many of the people who reach Congress have ties to paramilitarism, ties to drug trafficking, ties to the war in one way or another. And then, when a president with a different vision comes in to try to change things, to invest in building peace, and they see this in Congress, they think, no, this is going to take away our business. And the reforms never get approved. So I'm extremely concerned about this continuity of the relationship between Congress and the war. Because if Congress is where the laws are made in Colombia, and to end the war, we need laws and budgets to do so. But in Congress, it's managed by, let's say, these people who have always denied the conflict. We even had a president named Alvaro Uribe who spent his 8 or 10 years in government denying that there was armed conflict in Colombia. And do you know with whom he negotiated? With the paramilitaries. And with the guerrilla, he negotiated with bullets. It worries me. It worries me a lot. I think it's very difficult to change this logic.
It's great that you spoke about young people, privileged young people who have access to the Congress, who have access to positions of power and means of gaining power for themselves through their parents or even through the communities that they are a part of. It's clear to me that there is a clear divide. There is a fracture between young people in Colombia as well. Where do you stand on this issue?
No, I take the side of the victims of the armed conflict, regardless of whether they were harmed by the left or the right. But that's where I stand, because that is the central focus, the rights of the victims. Then, obviously, I move toward a much more progressive position, if you can call it that, where it is necessary to transform institutions, including Congress. And if Congress is not transformed, then we won't be able to push through any structural change. But I position myself on the side of the victims, and that's where I want to be, and that's where I start from. Many victims feel hatred towards the FARC, and many towards the paramilitaries. But it is the victims who build peace, the victims I believe in the most. The mothers of Soacha, women whose children were killed, and yet they believe in building peace and in forgiving members of the public forces who killed them. That is where I am positioned.
You said that you're on the side of victims, right?
Right.
But young people are victims as well. In fact, you told me just before the interview that there are young people, even within the Universidad Nacional, who are vulnerable to being recruited by paramilitary groups or even guerrilla groups in Colombia. They are vulnerable too.
Yeah.
Are their needs any less than those of indigenous communities?
No. But unfortunately, all of us in this country are victims. When I ask my students, raise your hand if you consider yourself a victim of the armed conflict. Not everyone raises their hand. I ask those who don't, and I realize that behind their stories, their families were victims, and that is being a victim of the conflict. One is a victim either because they were recruited by a guerrilla group or because they were killed by the state. Unfortunately, we are all victims. The problem arises when discourses appear that deny there is a conflict producing victims. So, yes, we are all victims. But the most important thing is that we recognize that the conflict exists. Because otherwise, how can we even say we are victims? And when there are discourses that deny this, it is an attack on the rights of the victims. It's like tolerating intolerance. One can tolerate intolerance, but intolerance destroys tolerance itself. So that was the position that needs to be made.
What you said about recognition and acknowledgement gives me the perfect entry to the next part of the interview, where I want to talk about justice for communities. Now, it's, with special attention to the peace process. Because young people at universities are vulnerable to recruitment by guerrilla groups, many of whom are still active. That's one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is related to what you told me when we met earlier, that people in Colombia are primarily listeners and watchers. Colombia lacks a strong reading culture, which is understandable. Having said that, there are two dominant radio stations in Colombia. One of them is the RSN, that many people believe is a mouthpiece for the government, for government agendas, for government programs, for government narratives about the conflict as well. Many young people and the wider population in Colombia listen to such radio channels. They watch TV stations that, in my time here, in my experience here, provide very little coverage to the conflict itself. Even protests at universities that I have seen myself over the last few months or so have been related to Palestine, have been related to issues that are taking place outside Colombia. But rarely have I come across young people talk about or discuss at length about socioeconomic issues or the conflict or the civil war taking place within Colombia's borders. So it's interesting when you mentioned to me that there is a need for recognition, that there is a need for acknowledgement, because conversations taking place within Colombia reflect otherwise. Right? That is the second part of the problem as I see it. Now, given these two aspects to the Colombian conflict, which by themselves are in contrast to each other, where do you see relevance for the HEP in Colombia?
Okay, so the HEP is a part of a transitional justice model, and this is completely innovative to Colombia for two main reasons. The first is that Colombia has always had an ordinary justice system based on punishment. So, you catch the person responsible, send them to prison, and the rights of the victim are set aside. They don't even matter. The second reason has to do with the capacity to forgive, because we are in a tension between justice and peace. So, there has to be a negotiation about what to prioritize, and the HEP exists within that dilemma. It is a transitional justice model that tries to mediate between justice and the peace that the country needs. The problem is that, since we are a very violent country, people don't want to think so much about forgiveness, they want punishment. What the HEP is trying to do is say there have to be responsible parties, they have to assume their responsibilities. But it does no good to send them to prison and let them rot for 30 years. We need to get those responsible to work for peace in favor of the victims. So, this HEP system is tremendously important because it changes a mindset that has been tied to 70 years of war. It's a justice system not based on war, but based on building peace.
Okay, fine. Let's take what you're saying about the HEP at face value. Maybe it is indeed a middle path. Let's look at the HEP from that perspective. With this perspective in mind, do you see the HEP having any role to play in affecting the narrative around the peace process in Colombia itself? I ask you this because I still see a great deal of frustration, resentment, and fear among people when you talk about paramilitary groups, when you talk about, say, dissidents from Las FARC, or even the ALN for that matter. So do you see the HEP playing any role in changing the way people talk about the conflict in the first place?
Definitely. Because the people who submit themselves to the HEP start from one fact They acknowledge that they are responsible. That is, the first condition for the HEP to accept you is to recognize that you are responsible. In the ordinary justice system, the first thing people do is say, I'm not responsible. So the first step is to accept my responsibility. And from there, they are bound by the truth they provide. The HEP judges the FARC and members of the public force, starting from the fact that they are already responsible. Depending on the amount of truth they tell, they eventually reach the point where they receive a benefit for telling the truth. So this is crucial because many of those responsible in the ordinary justice system always denied their responsibility. They always said, no, I didn't kill those young people. No, I'm not responsible. No, I had nothing to do with that. And now, in the HEP, they are saying, I had everything to do with that. I am responsible. I killed your son. I shouldn't have done it. So it completely changes the narrative.
Moving on from discussing the narrative of the conflict to a sense of closure. Do you find that the HEP has been vital and helpful in providing them with a sense of closure? Justice, I believe, is appropriate when people are compensated for what they've lost. But does that compensation equate to emotional closure as well? Has the HEP been helpful in providing emotional closure to people who were both directly affected by the conflict as well as indirectly affected?
Definitely. It has brought people closer to the conflict because you have the content on YouTube, on social media, on Facebook, or on Instagram, showing the perpetrators saying, yes, I am guilty, and the victims saying, my dignity was taken from me and now it is being restored. In these ways, the HEP is fundamental in bringing people closer to what they might feel they never experienced or what they deny ever happened. I'll give you one example that is vital to understanding how the HEP has achieved this. The mothers of the false positives, that is, mothers of young people, teenagers like us, who were killed and presented as guerrillas of the FARC, but they were not. Now, these mothers fought for 20 years to clear their children's names and to say not only were they not guerrillas, but the public forces killed them. And to have those testimonies, to be able to hear them, and to see the mothers now saying, no, we weren't crazy. They acknowledge their responsibility and we forgive them. That is a way of bringing people closer to the conflict.
To my knowledge, Alvaro Uribe was one of the first presidents who was allegedly responsible for false positives in Colombia. Yet, while the HEP has definitely brought a lot more false positive cases to the surface, and they've reminded the public of false positive cases, I find it ironical that people in Colombia continue voting for individuals and candidates to the Senate, to the Congress, to even the presidency for that matter, who in one way or another were related to false positive cases, who in one way or another were contributing to false positive cases, who were contributing to the continuation of the conflict itself by enabling and supporting paramilitary groups. Why do you think that is the case?
First, because they needed to instill an ideology of the internal enemy. So, communism is everywhere. And besides instilling that ideology, any action by the public forces becomes legitimate. If the first thing I do is legitimize the idea that communism is infiltrating the country, as happened in Vietnam, as happened in Iraq, as happened in other countries, in Cuba, right? Then what do you achieve? You strengthen the war. And once you strengthen the war, you start having ties not only with paramilitaries, but as you said, with organizations that finance the war and end up displacing people to set up mega mining projects, oil and livestock businesses. It's a vicious cycle, right? So it's all connected. Alvaro Uribe should have already been tried by the HEP for the false positives because he is ultimately responsible. He was the head of the presidency with the most false positives in Colombia's history. But since we lost the peace plebiscite, that meant renegotiating the peace agreement, and that involved taking away the HEP's ability to try former presidents, and he is the most responsible. So it's clear that presidents need to be brought to trial. Alvaro Uribe will eventually become the first president in Colombia's history to be tried, not for the false positives, but for other offenses. But it's all connected. Paramilitarism, internal enemy, it's all connected.
You spoke about young people in Colombia, spoke about the conflict, past, present. You spoke about the HEP. You've spoken about political candidates as well, past and present. Given the HEP, given the current state and stage of the Colombian conflict, given a sense of disillusionment among young people in Colombia, given growing social and economic inequalities in Colombia, what is your perspective on the future of politics in Colombia? Do you see social and economic inequality widening and growing? Do you see prospects or possibilities for peace and reconciliation in Colombia? Or do you see existing problems becoming deeper?
I see with hope that we were able to have the first president who truly represents the values of change. That gives me hope because we always believed that they would never let this person reach the presidency. Given that in Colombia's history, around 5 or 6 presidential candidates have been killed, and now this person got elected. So that's good. The vote matters, and that's the first step. What's the problem? The Congress. We need to get more people into Congress who align with the politics of change, and I hope that will happen in 2026. I do have hope. It hasn't been taken from me. If we have a majority in Congress, the reforms will pass and negotiations will be easier. I am enormously concerned about the continuation of the war in Colombia. If we don't overcome the war, no matter how many reforms are passed in Congress, we won't be able to implement them in the territories in the periphery you mentioned. I worry about the peace processes, but I believe that transitional justice, the HEP, the Truth Commission, the unit for the search of disappeared persons has made enormous progress. It has made progress covering around 70 years, literally clarifying what has been happening. And even though it has been slow, the progress has been significant. Just seeing a victim speak is enough for me. So I feel hopeful, even though I feel disappointed at how slowly change has progressed. But that's to be expected. This is 70 years of war, 200 years of same political history. That isn't going to change in 4 years.
If you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. At Pax Politica, we tell stories throughout the world of peace building and human rights that aren't covered by mainstream media. And every bit of support from you would help us do exactly that. So hit that like button and share the video with your friends and colleagues. We'll see you next time and thanks for watching. See you in the next one.